want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
So welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, where I try to separate fact from fiction in the JFK assassination and try to give you something of substance rather than the usual idiocy you find on YouTube or on the internet from the conspiracy idiots. So today, my special guest is Dr. Chad Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman was born and raised in Sioux City, Iowa. He graduated from Northwestern College of Chiropractic in 1999, and he practiced in Sioux City, Colorado, and now in Fargo, North Dakota. He also now has a true crime podcast called Footsteps in the Dark. Now, what makes Dr. Zimmerman so interesting is he is one of the few doctors to have actually examined JFK's autopsy x-rays and photographs. And I thought that he could basically come on here and really tell us exactly what those autopsy materials tell us. So welcome, Dr. Zimmerman.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so how did you get into the JFK assassination?
I think I read this, it might have been in your bio or somebody else that you talked to. Very similar. I got into it when I was in high school. My father took me to the movie JFK by Oliver Stone. I was transfixed by what I had just seen. And then my father started to kind of feed it. And he bought me On the Trail of the Assassins by Jim Garrison. I started reading it. I happened to be on a trip to New Orleans at the time, begged my mother to let me go walk or take me around the French Quarter so I could go see 544 Camp Street and, all the sites. And so I think the movie was the seed, the books were the fertilizer. And by 96, I think it was, I taught my former high school history class on the top 20 reasons I was convinced that JFK was killed as a result of a conspiracy.
Right.
And then I went to school and I got smarter. And after having physics education and medical education and different things like that, I happened to stumble across a book called Case Closed by Gerald Posner. And then I became very confused. And when I'm confused, I start tearing things apart. And that's kind of what happened. When I graduated chiropractic school, I got a job. I started developing an income. And I started purchasing resources. And one of those would have been the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission report. I went through every single page of that. I bought a Carcano like Oswald's. I have ammunition just like it. And I got on the forums. I got on the old, assassination.jfk stuff. I started interacting with people. Eventually, I became a moderator in that group. And spent a few years doing that, got to have some really interesting conversations with a lot of very interesting people. And I just started working through it. I had my top 20 reasons why I was convinced it was a conspiracy. And I went through each one of them line by line, and I kept crossing them off. And by the time I got done, there was really nothing left.
Right.
And my intent on it, I think, was probably a little ego gratification at that time in my life, and wanted to potentially write the next great bestseller book or something. But, I think the draw to true crime for most of us is that we know it happened. We know there's a truth that exists and that we want to find it. And that's where the JFK journey took me. I had some, very neat opportunities there. I was able to go to the archives, see the original autopsy photographs and x-rays, and spent 3.5 hours with Larry Sturdivant there doing that. But then by the time I got done, I had a U.S. public that was 80% convinced of the conspiracy, and I was now 20% that didn't believe in that anymore. So I kind of moved on from it, honestly.
Right. Okay, so very much one question about New Orleans. When you went to, was the Newman building still there when you went to 544 Camp Street?
Yeah, it was.
Oh, you didn't? Did you go inside at all, or?
No, I didn't go inside. We just we walked around. I'm trying to, we're going back, 29 years here. No, we didn't do much. We walked around. I remember if it was it was probably around that year. We took a trip, my mother and I, to Dallas, and that's when I visited the book depository for the first time.
Right.
And I think at that time I was still pretty convinced of a conspiracy. I had a roommate or a gentleman that lived across the hall from me, and he had a big giant stack of VHS tapes full of conspiracy theory shows on JFK, and so I would borrow those and watch those, and so I had 1,000 times more information telling me it was a conspiracy than I had otherwise, which generally means you got to find 5,000 times more things to change your mind. But I think I did that in the course of 4 or 5 years. So
Obviously, your expertise is really on the medical and ballistic evidence. So perhaps you can tell us a bit about how it happened that you went to the archives to see the autopsy materials.
well, okay. So that was about 2004. I got into this about 2000. At some point, I would naturally gravitate towards the things I had some background in, which was medical and ballistic. And I started looking at things. One of the things that stands out that I remember was there being confusion about where Kennedy was hit with the first shot. Was it at the base of the neck? Was it T2? Was it T3? Where was it? And I had a lot of resources available to me at the time. We had an autopsy report. Nobody really questioned the 14 centimeter dimension that was written, right below the mastoid. And I thought, okay, well, there's a starting point here. I had an X-ray bank with hundreds of full spine X-rays that my employers had. And so I started making measurements. You could see the mastoid, you could draw it down. I used myself as a model. I took X-rays. And so I started just investigating what's the truth here. Pretty soon I realized that, 14 centimeters below the mastoid in the neutral position, like Kennedy pretty much was at autopsy, would land right near the base of the neck in a 6 foot tall individual. And so I went through the steps of showing that and proving it to myself first. And then I would have discussions about it. Eventually it led to a web page. I kind of got tired of explaining a whole bunch of things over and over again. So I created a website where I would post articles on these various aspects that I was looking at. And it just, kind of evolved over time. I got into the ballistics aspect. I bought the rifle. I had to make my own rounds because it was $200 to $300 a box for the Western cartridge rounds. And so I was collecting those on the side. That was a lot of money to me back then, so I didn't want to shoot them. So I bought 1,000 rounds of old World War II ammunition, started pulling the bullets because they were all corrosive, repackaging them into new brass and powder. And then I would go out and I would conduct ballistics experiments. And sometimes they'd say, I think the first shot hit a tree branch. Could you go shoot it and show me what a bullet would look like if it does that? And so I would go out on lunch. I had long lunch breaks, about an hour and a half, and I could drive about 15 miles, shoot some things, videotape it, come back, pull off the data, and move on to the next thing. So I did a lot of X-ray. I did a lot of ballistic stuff. And eventually over time, developed a pretty good understanding of things, or at least I thought I did. And I wanted to see, I couldn't test my hypotheses any further unless I had the actual autopsy photographs. And we were extremely transfixed on the Fox #8 photograph, the very close-up one. The Grodin books and the different books always publish that thing to make it look like it's the back of the head, and you have the exit beveling, and so it had to be a shot from the front. And I had gotten a high-quality scan from a disc I think I bought off a JFK Lancer or something, and I was convinced that it was oriented incorrectly, and that I could see a jar, right, kind of in that bottom right corner. And so I wanted to see it. So my whole trip to the archives started with this burning desire that I had to test, a hypothesis. And so I had found out that Larry Sertivan had gotten permission to go. And so I reached out to Larry, and he forwarded the letter he'd sent to me. I read through his letter. I put my own letter together, sent it off to attorney Paul G. Kirk. And then sure as heck, I got approved to do it. And so Larry and I scheduled the time to meet and flew out there. And it was a really wonderful experience. It's a tremendous facility they have there.
This building holds in trust the records of a nation. It is the United States National Archive. Here are preserved the documents most cherished by Americans.
And obviously tremendous care that they provide for these irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind American artifacts, which is kind of what they are now. But Larry and I spent 3.5 hours in a room. We, looking at them. We couldn't touch anything. If you wanted something moved, they had to move it. But we were able to make some drawings of some things. We wanted to see if we could answer some of the questions. Where was the head wound at? What was the orientation of the F8 photograph? What could we see in the x-rays? That was a really big one and a really interesting experience, because the quality of the x-rays is it's infinitely better than the stuff that anyone else is looking at. Those are poor Xerox copies that are kind of black and white, whereas we're looking at an actual x-ray film it's actually light blue. It's dark with shades of blue in it, and there's so much detail in those x-rays, and you could obviously see what were bullet fragments. They were as white as light as could possibly be. And so as we looked through those things, I would say there was 3, 4, 5 really interesting takeaways that we got from that experience. And then I came back. I thought we had made some great discoveries, and I started digging through Hume's and Boswell's prior testimonies, and I think it was probably the HSCA stuff, and I was going through their testimonies as they're looking at the autopsy photographs and the x-rays, and sure enough, here they're describing what I saw, and here they're describing what I saw, but they didn't know what they were seeing. In many cases, one of the most eye-popping discoveries was looking at the lateral x-ray of President Kennedy's shattered skull. And in the rear kind of lower posterior portion back here, you could see little bone shards. Okay, they were the same exact density as the bone pieces you were seeing everywhere else, but here they were inside of the skull. And the only way those could have gotten there is by being blown into it from an entrance wound in the back of the head. So we went looking for where's this entrance wound at? And on the actual lateral view, you really can't see, and so they enhanced it, right? There's the enhanced lateral x-ray, and when you look at that, sure as heck you can see a spot right in the center of the back of the head, in the most rearmost portion of the head. There's a defect right there, and it looks like it might have been a little bit of beveling there. And it certainly correlates with what we found in the F8 photograph, because the F8 photograph shows the entrance wound. That was interesting, because here we're looking at multiple color photographs of that image, right? And what you find out is that the camera angles is kind of like from this angle down and in, and the ruler is where it's at, because they're trying to point out where the entrance wound is. And so you could, when you were looking at the pictures, you could look at them and kind of tell what order they were even taken in. In one of the pictures, so imagine you have a child's bottle of bubbles, right? And you shake it up a little bit, you take the lid off, and you have that film across the top of it. Yep. Okay. There was film across the hole in the scalp, but the film was blood. Okay. And it was covering the entire hole. And then you'd look at the next picture, and that little film had broken, and there was this kind of violet purplish light that was coming through there. And you're looking at that, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's the entrance wound right there. Right. And so if you could take these pictures and triangulate them a little bit, make sense of them, you could exactly pinpoint where that entrance wound was. And we had an old 1960s military stereoscope I bought off of eBay, and we brought it there, and we had them put them side by side and look, so we could develop a 3-dimensional image and things like that. Anyway, what I ended up concluding was that the pathologists, 2.5 centimeters right, slightly above the EOP, they were wrong, and it was about an inch or so above that. And it wasn't where the cowlick entrance was. There's nothing at the cowlick entrance, and there's no such trail of fragments. Right? Trails of fragments exist in closed systems. A blown apart skull is no longer a closed system, and you can't rely on the placement of things very well. And So we're looking at this, we're seeing this spot on the rear of the most posterior part of this lateral x-ray. And that's where those pencil lines, right? Remember the whole thing about the pencil lines? Well, the pencil lines were on it, and there's a horizontal one that matches the bottom of the film. So it's we called it the horizontal film plane line there. And then the other one goes right up through the middle of the missing area of the skull, but they converge right back at that exact point. And it's that part of the film that's cut off in the reproduction on the HSCA stuff. That's where it looked like the entrance was. Okay. And so the question became, okay, how did the pathologists get it wrong? And I'm always going to rely on pathologists because they're looking at it, right? It's hard to say they're wrong, but they were wrong. And so why were they wrong? And so I started looking at the pre-mortem x-ray of Kennedy, and okay, they measured from the EOP. Where's the EOP? And I'm looking at this thing. Where's the EOP? You can't see a very distinct EOP on an X-ray. It's got to be probably even harder when it's the actual skull bone and there's blood and all that kind of stuff. And so I had read a book written by a forensic anthropologist, and so I thought, well, what the heck? Early days of the internet, everybody had a website and a contact email. I thought, well, send her an email. And so I sent her an email. I said, I'm looking at an X-ray. I've attached it. I'm just trying to find the EOP on this. It's part of a class project, maybe, or something like that. Could you help me out? And she emailed back. She goes, oh, it's called a bun EOP. That means they hardly have one. Very hard to find. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that's the reason, right? When you're looking at the back of someone's skull, you can figure out the center of it. But if you can't figure out where the landmark is, it's really hard to say slightly above or really far above or give an exact measurement. And so I thought, well, maybe the answer to this is really simple. They couldn't see the EOP. Maybe that's why they got it wrong. And I think that's so much of this confusion over the decades has come from such a simple little mistake like that.
So how far? So in their estimate, how far was the entrance wound from what they were saying? Like, was it? They said slightly above. They're saying it was an inch.
Slightly above. I don't know what slightly above means.
Right. Yeah.
An a half, 3/8 of an inch. I would put the entrance at somewhere in the neighborhood of an inch to an inch and a half above the EOP.
Right. Okay.
I would put it. Yeah.
So why do you think that the HSE got it all wrong in saying the entrance wound was in the cowlick area?
Well, now I'm going on old memories here, but if you go back and you read through the interviews of the pathologists, they couldn't figure out where it was. Right, they're looking at the picture, the back of the head photograph, and there's a ruler here and there's a hole here, and they're saying that's not a bullet hole. Right? I mean, that's happened. And they're going, well, what's that little white thing down there? Maybe it was down there. Like they didn't know. They had it in their heads that it was lower than it was, and then they went looking for it and couldn't find it, and it resulted in all this confusion, And then you have this panel put together of experts looking at stuff. I don't know how long they looked at stuff, but they looked at it long enough to somehow conclude that a trail of fragments that leads nowhere. Like if you follow that trail, it hits bone, and then the break in the bone's way down here, right? So what kind of trail is that where you got to make a left turn in order to find the fracture in the bone? So I don't know. Like I remember years ago, Bugliosi, I was corresponding with him on some things. I just gotten back from the archives, and he was putting the finishing touches on his book, and I thought, well, I'm going to reach out to him and see if I strike pay dirt with anything, and just thought I had some interesting observations for him. And I would bring up things about the x-rays or the photographs, anatomical placements, whatever. And they didn't agree with one of the previous esteemed bodies, but he asked me the same thing. He's like, well, why are you saying this when these people with these degrees say this? And I don't know. All I can tell you is that I went to college from 1996 to 1999. X-rays were not well in use, probably until the 40s or 50s or something like that. The quality, and so you look at these doctors that are pathologists in the 60s, what's the quality of the textbooks that they're working with when they went to school? I don't know, probably not very good. The things that I saw on the X-rays, I think any first-year chiropractic student will see the same things on an X-ray, right? There's a difference between what a bone shard, the density of a bone shard versus the density of a metallic fragment on an X-ray. It's night and day. But I'm
Right.
reading the pathology reports and they're getting confused and they don't know what it is. So it tells me that I think in terms of our Western medicine and our science and our education, we've come a really long ways from the time that they went to school to the time I did. That's the only way I can explain it.
And so were there fracture lines coming out of the entrance wound in the back of the head?
But you couldn't see that. I mean, you can't see the entrance. The only way,
Uh,
let me look. When you're taking something that's three-dimensional and squishing it into two dimensions. So it makes the whole three-dimensionality of it very difficult. And so when you're looking like an A to P, you're losing that depth perspective, right? Everything's smushed like this. Now you couldn't really see the entrance wound clearly in the AP. You understand the whole skull is a fractured mess at this point. It would take a long time to sketch out the fracture pattern on it. Let me put it that way, okay? And try to figure out what's left side versus right side on like a lateral view. Now, could there have been some fractures? There probably were. Man, it's been so many years that it's been a while since I've thought about that. I think there was, but you're going to lose a lot of that depth being smushed into the posterior fossa on a lateral view. And so it's going to be hard seeing anything coming from it. But then when you get up into other areas of the skull, you're going to see some of those fracture lines. But it's, like I said, it's very difficult with a skull that's damaged to try to make sense of it all, But as I recall, I think there was a fracture line there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been terribly interested in that location anyway. Yeah, you lose a lot of that perspective.
Right. So there's so many questions here. So well, first off, I really wish they'd actually make the autopsy X-rays and photographs public because there's the bootlegs out there, and I think they should actually make them public so people can do their own analysis.
Yeah, I go back and forth. I've always gone back and forth on that. I think of like if I had a child and the child was murdered in some way, would I want the images of that all over the place just because people have some sort of a stuck interest in it. So as a family member, I can understand why they might not want something like that. And now in terms of something that we've turned into a political explanation for everything under the sun, maybe it's not a bad idea to put that stuff out there to answer some questions for people or something. But, is there a long-term effect in doing that? I don't know.
Well, I agree with you, but I would not want these out if it was, the only reason I want it out is the fact that we already have so many photos in the public domain right now. So
yeah, I mean, I agree.
I'd rather have the real thing out there. So, particularly the X-rays. I don't think there's much harm in releasing the X-rays.
No, the X-rays are very interesting to look at, and I think putting the color version F8 out there would end all of this. So much of this nonsense that it shows an exit crater from a frontal shot. It clearly does not show that. It shows exactly the opposite. Deep down inside, if you're a Kennedy family member, what does it matter? There's people that are flat earthers out there.
Yeah.
You could give them everything. There could have been a high quality videotape of the actual assassination, and you give it to people, and it's just fake.
Yeah.
Right?
So let me ask you a bit about the entrance wound in the head. So Dr. Bodden said that if there was a lower than the colic entrance wound, then the cerebellum would have been damaged, but the cerebellum was not damaged. So do you see any problem?
I don't think that's true.
Right.
You saw the photographs of the brain.
Yep.
The cerebellum, we looked at those. If I remember, I think we looked at those in 3D too. So you have the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere looked like a plate of spaghetti. Okay, left hemisphere was completely intact. We looked. There was a view of it from the inferior angle, and I could see some very small linear little tears almost. Like, I don't know if it was like in the meninges or something, but it looked like something that would have happened when you put your hands down and tried to lift the brain out. It looked very explainable, but no, there was no bullet damage to it. But your cerebellum's back there,
Right.
right? And you understand that. So cowlick, and then roughly the autopsy entrance point. So this is the two things they're talking about. It's got to be this or it's got to be this.
Right.
Nobody talked about this. And that's going to be above the cerebellum right there.
Right.
So
And
I think
so,
that supports that,
right. So what I find interesting is actually there are no photographs of the brain out there. There's some drawings.
Correct.
But the fact that the left hemisphere of the brain is intact is proof that there's no shot from the grassy knoll or the side.
That's a near perpendicular shot.
Right.
Yeah, there's no way.
And so that forces conspiracy people to say that the Stringer, those are not JFK's brain, right? That there's somebody else's brain.
Yeah, I mean it's fake. It's tampered with. Somebody, everything's fake and tampered with when it doesn't agree. So, or I don't know how do you counter the nonsense?
No, I know. So was there any indication that any of those materials had been altered or faked?
Not that we could see. No, I mean,
Right.
I don't know how you would have done it in 1963 or 65 or whenever they think these things happened. I remember years ago, I remember reading that if you viewed the photographs, I think this came from Grodin, because I think Grodin, which I don't know how he got to be part of the HSCA, but he was, I think he even admitted that the pictures were authentic. Okay.
Yeah.
And he made the comment that if you looked at a stereo pair of these pictures under a stereoscope, that had they been tampered with, it would be, as obvious as could be. And, we didn't look at every single one of them in stereo pairs. We looked at F8, we looked at the brain. There was no evidence of that. But further, one of the things that stood out to me was, if you looked, I sent you a link to Lee Oswald's autopsy photographs, right?
Yeah.
Did you notice the double exposures and some of the terrible photography, right? Kennedy, the best thing about him being, hijacked from Texas and sent to Maryland is they had the guy that taught the course there that night, and the photographs were fantastic. There might have been one or two out of 4 dozen or however many there were that were a little out of focus or something, but you could count the hairs on the side of his head. That's how clear a lot of those pictures were. So I don't know how they would have been faked.
Right. No, I don't know either. It's just. I mean, the other argument they say is that Stringer didn't take the bachelor view of the brain, but he took the other one. But of course, both views of the brain must have been consistent. How could I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
You can slice and dice your way out of facts a million different ways, but
what do you think of Dr. David Mantik's view of his density readings, saying that some of the X-rays had been altered?
Well, I mean, honestly, so at the point that I read that book, I was kind of on the fence about a lot of things. I was very excited to see that a book was coming out that was done by intelligent people with big degrees and interesting ideas and people that were actually testing things. That was my feeling going into it until I read the book, and then it kind of got destroyed. But I was really interested. Mantik, I thought, had a really interesting idea. And so he modified an optical densitometer and took it in there, and supposedly it made measurements at tenth of millimeter increments or some bizarrely small distance. And so I read it, it was interesting, and I went and I looked. He's in that book, they've got that pterodactyl superimposed over a lateral skull, and kind of mockery built into the book. And when I went and looked at the X-rays, I looked at it and I'm like, at this point in time, I've looked at hundreds of X-rays, something like that, hundreds or thousands of them, I don't know. And I mean, it was a part of my daily practice. And I'm looking at this lateral X-ray, and I'm like, this is a lateral X-ray. Like there was nothing crazy about it. They always taught you in school, step away from it, blur your vision a little bit. If anything doesn't look right, it probably isn't right. That was the radiologist teaching us this. And here I'm looking at this thing, and I'm backing away, I'm squinting, I'm looking at it. Nothing looked abnormal about that X-ray. And I don't know how you'd fake that thing, with the fracture patterns and all this kind of stuff. I would think anything faked in it would stand out like a sore thumb, but nothing did. It looked very, very, very genuine to me.
Okay.
So then, and that brings me to the point, because kind of where we're leading into there, one of the things that we wanted to look at was that 6.5 millimeter fragment, right? That people think, oh, they took, a slice of the bullet and x-rayed it and stuck it on there. And that was, ta-da, the case against Oswald. And the first thing that stood out to me looking at that actual x-ray is that it's not a nice, neat, semicircular slice. It has some irregular margin to it that doesn't come through in the crappy reproduction that the HSCA put out there. But as we got in, we looked in and started looking a little closer. I looked at Larry and I said, Larry, there's another fragment inside of that fragment. And he looked and he's like, yep. And I said, but look at the rest of the film. I said, you have these grid lines, right? And for the viewer, what grid lines are. So normally you take a film cassette and you put it in this tray and slide it into this big thing, and then you line your subject up, and it's called a film bucky. And inside of the cassette, there are what are called these rare earth screens. And when x-rays hit it, they glow. And so they can use these rare earth screens to create something that will help expose the x-ray utilizing less x-rays, right? And so it's a safety measure. We don't have to use as much x-ray to create the image. But if you don't have a film bucky, because the purpose of the film bucky is that when you push the exposure button, it's supposed to vibrate really quick like this so you don't create lines on the x-ray, okay? Now, in my practice at the time, we had a plain film x-ray machine, and you could just turn the bucky off. You could still put a picture in there, because some things they don't want you, x-raying extremities, for instance. Sometimes they didn't want you to have the film bucky on and create any subtle little change to the x-ray. So sometimes we would turn it off. But anyway, I was able to replicate, a skull. I had a plastic skull, and took an x-ray of it with the film bucky off in order to create, a baseline. So anyway, we're kind of circling around in different directions here. Kennedy's x-rays were not taken in a film bucky. They would lay the cassette right under his head or stick it right next to his head or whatever they wanted to look at, and they would take the x-ray right there, and always left these grid lines, okay? Well, I'm looking at this 6.5 millimeter fragment, and inside of it, there's another fragment in there. And so there's enough contrast between the two fragments that we could still see the two fragments. And I thought, well, okay, if this was a fake, they'd have to put the bigger fragment in there later, and you would still see these grid lines, just shadows of these grid lines in there. And we didn't see that. And I thought, okay, well, this to me seems like this is legit. It's a legitimate fragment on a legitimate x-ray. And so I remember coming back to my office, and man, that sat with me for a long time. And I sat and thought about it. And so I decided to test it. And I took a small metal fragment and taped it onto this plastic skull that I had, took an x-ray with the grid lines, and the fragment obscured the grid lines from showing up. So you had this nice, neat white fragment with grid lines around it. So then I took another fragment, and I made just an X-ray of a larger fragment. So now I have a film that's all black with just this white, round, semicircular fragment. So then I had a piece of copy film. Now, copy film works differently. It's exposed by fluorescent lights or whatever. And so you'd go into the dark room, and you'd put your copy film down, and then you would put your skull film down with the grid lines on it, and you'd make a duplicate I think I did it the other way around. I think I put the the black film with the big fragment in, and I made an image of that. Or anyway, however I did it, this was a long time ago. I did one, then the other, to do what Mantic claimed was done. Okay. And when I developed it, it was perfect, but you could see the grid lines. You couldn't see it around the small fragment, but you could see the grid lines within that larger fragment, exactly like I predicted it would have to be. And that did not exist in that X-ray at the National Archives. So I became absolutely convinced that it was original, that 6.5 millimeter fragment existed and was real. And so later down the road, I ended up in contact with Mantic. There was another researcher, and because it was John somebody, and I can't
John
remember.
Hunt?
So I won't name it, but he was the intermediary going back and forth, and I brought this fact up about these grid lines and how there weren't any within the boundaries of that larger fragment. And he came back, Mantic came back and said, "Oh, I checked my notes from the archives, and it says that there were grid lines inside the fragment." And I thought, oh, okay, now we're he said, she said kind of a thing. I have the chiropractic degree. He's got the fancy medical degree. I'm screwed, right? Because this is where I would love for them to release those things, because then I could show you what I was talking about. So anyway, we dropped the argument at that point. It was kind of a no-win situation. But I went back and I looked at his OD measurements, and he has this line, and it goes up like this and across the 6.5 millimeter fragment like that. And they're taking these at these extremely tiny, minute increments and stuff. Well, if there were grid lines, his little graph would go like this, and these would be the grid lines. There's no evidence of the grid lines in his own OD data. There's no evidence of the grid lines in his own OD data. Right? So anyway, I'm pretty convinced that's a legit X-ray.
Right,
That's a legit fragment, so.
Okay, and so tell me, with the entrance to JFK's neck, there's some people who would say it's impossible for it to enter at the base of the neck and exit the throat without hitting the vertebra. And so it's an impossible shot. Is that true?
It's not impossible. You just don't hit the vertebrae. These are lumbar spine vertebrae. They're only so big. They have spaces between and the whole 9 yards. I mean, they can be missed. People get shot in that area frequently, and the bone's not hit. So I most of the time that argument gets made, it's because they're thinking of the anatomy incorrectly. Okay, we forget that when you're looking at the neck, that the lower part of the neck is tilted like this, right? Well, how can a bullet that hits at, let's say this is C7, how can a bullet at C7 drop 2 inches and still be at C7? Well, it's because the plane is on an angle like this, right? And so when you're not I took 8 months of gross human anatomy. I dissected cadavers, all those kinds of things, and we tend to think of things in terms of plane angles and things that the average person doesn't. But the statement is nonsense. You certainly can. There was no evidence that a bone was hit with him. I saw his lower cervical X-ray. So if you go back to Dr. Latimer, and he thought he saw little bone chips or something like that in that X-ray. There's nothing there. I stared at that thing for like 10 minutes. I couldn't find anything that looked like little bone chips or anything. I think he saw there might have been just some. It's very common. Most X-rays have some kind of small little artifacts on it, just artifacts from film processing and stuff. And there might have been some small little linear things like that, but you couldn't see any bone damage at all. You go back to the pathology reports, of course, if you're a non-believer in those, then turn this off right now, I guess. But they couldn't find any damage to bone, right? The lung apex was bruised, not penetrated. So a bullet had to traverse at a distance high enough to cause a bruise, but not damage the lung apex. If you look at the anatomy of the lung apex, it's, what is it, T1, the lung apex? Is at the vertebral level of T1. So the bullet had to come in above that because the lung wasn't hit,
Right.
right? Pretty soon, now you're above the collarbone, now you're above the rib cage, you're above everything. Now you just have to be far enough to the right not to hit a transverse process or something. And that's not that difficult, you know? Honestly, if you look at the trajectories based on Dale Meyer's stuff, it works out just fine.
Right. So what do you think what do you make of the people who tell us, well, look at what the Parkland doctors said, and they all we have to take what they said seriously,
Okay.
and that's
Well,
proof of a shot from the front.
okay. Well, my first thought on that is let's scrap the FAA and anything they do on plane crash investigations and just go with what the people on the ground saw. Right?
Right.
We'd have more plane crashes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's people forget, people that aren't in healthcare, I don't think quite understand that there's an enormous difference between a general practice doctor and an ER doctor and a cardiothoracic surgeon versus an orthopedist. They don't know all things, okay? And your emergency trauma people, they're amazing people. What they can process in minutely short periods of time to save lives is amazing, right? And they're the firefighters. You bring them in to put out the fire, okay?
Right.
Great. But they don't know how to put it back together again. That's why they bring in the other surgeons, right? And so you've got a bunch of firefighters in the medical field that are trying to put out a fire. And what was it, a minute or two that went by before they noticed he was shot in the head? And then he's dead. Okay, wrap it up, get it out, get to the next thing, and then let's let the people that have hours and hours of time on their hands to methodically go through this and figure out what happened. And so you always have to lean towards your pathologists who are spending the hours with the body trying to figure things out, not the people that spent minutes trying to save a life that was unfortunately extinguished. They weren't with the body very long.
Yeah, no, they were 15, 20 minutes, and they were a very crowded room. They were frantic, trying to do all sorts of stuff.
They're not, they're not probing the wounds and checking angles, and they had no idea what the extent of the damage to the skull was or where bullets hit. That wasn't their job. That's somebody else's job. So.
Yeah, no, I'm struck by there was the ARRB interviewed a forensic radiologist. And Douglas Horn, who was part of the process, asked that radiologist, "What do you think of the Parkland doctors?" He said, "I couldn't care less. I have no, throw it out. I don't even bring it up, And I thought, yeah, I just don't get why people are so fixated on the Parkland doctors.
Well, I think, the answer, to be honest with you, the answer is that I view the followers of the Kennedy assassination kind of like I view people with political attitudes. You have 40% that always vote this way and 40% that always vote this way, and you have 20% in the middle trying to figure things out. And that's kind of the way it is in this group too. The vast majority of the people in the community already have their mind made up, and so they naturally subconsciously seek out things that support their opinion, and then when they're countered with something that disputes their opinion, then they'll go to extreme lengths to try to preserve their opinion by invoking Parkland ER doctors over the autopsy pathologists, and they feel perfectly justified in doing it.
Yeah.
But logically, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and it's the same reason why I don't really spend that much time debating on Facebook or elsewhere with hardcore conspiracy believers, because I'll never change their mind. But I want to post my articles so that people in the middle perhaps can read what I've written, and maybe they'll be influenced.
Yeah, well, that's all you can do. You can, lead the horse to water and hope they take a drink, but that's all you can do. So.
Okay, well, here's a question for you. The hole in Kennedy's jacket and shirt, isn't that evidence of a very low bullet wound to the back?
Oh God, no, it's not, because bodies and clothings move, right? And so unless you have clothing and a body in the same exact position, it's worthless information. I can't tell you the dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of hours that I put in on that issue. It was stupidly insane, but I was 20 something and I had a lot of energy, I guess. But, I went through dozens and dozens and dozens of x-rays. It was Cliff Varnell was the guy that was prodding me and all this stuff. And, he was the guy, this guy, music buff in San Francisco who thought there's no way a tailored outfit would ever bunch up, which I thought was a pretty poor argument. But I put the work in. I went through dozens of X-rays. We looked at things like, what level is the chin at relative to the spine in a relatively neutral position, and the 14 centimeter chromium measurements and massoid measurements, and reproduced it on X-rays, and just over and over and over again. The reality is that the second you take a thin folded shirt and you put it on, the linear relationships from this button to this button change, right? The dimensions change. And then, so it changes just from putting it on. It changes from, moving your arm up. It changes if you lean back and the clothing gets pushed up a little bit. You can watch on almost any news show where they're interviewing people, somebody's sitting in a chair wearing a suit and it's got a big bunched up spot in it, And so what did I do? I got a shirt. I measured the same distance. I, glued on a piece of metal to it, put it in front of an X-ray. If my arm's down, where's it at? What if I do this? And, we did all of these different things. And sure enough, when it had to be bunched up to be in that position.
Right.
Okay? And so,
can a shirt and a jacket bunch up at the same time?
Yeah, clearly it did, it can or it can't. Those are the two options, but
right.
They do bunch. It's a 50% thing, and maybe so I don't know. It's again, it's kind of grasping at straws to try to make a preconceived conclusion work, I think. But the data was the data in terms of when I went through the whole thing. So,
and what is your thoughts on the single bullet theory?
Now I'm remembering. So in 2004, it was right around the same time that I went to the archives. Earlier that year, I came to work on a Saturday. I checked my email. My website was out at that time. Anyway, I had an email from somebody that had come across my website, and it said, hey, came across your website. Good job. Nice to see somebody, drawing a fine-tooth comb through things a little bit. Keep up the good work. And I thought, oh, well, that's nice. And I looked at the signature, and the person that signed it, it said Hugh Ainsworth. And I thought, hey, gosh, that name sounds really familiar to me. And so I Googled, maybe he's part of the community or something. Hugh Ainsworth, JFK. And Hugh Ainsworth, Dallas Morning News reporter who is the only person in history who was there when Kennedy was shot, was there when Oswald was arrested, and was there when Oswald was shot by Ruby. Wow. And so I thought it was a joke, right? And I thought, so I wrote him back and I said, you're somebody I've always wanted to talk to. Is there a time that we could talk at some point? So I get a number, and sure enough, it's a Dallas number. And so I called it and probably had a 10 or 15 minute conversation with you. And we talked about Judith Berry Baker because her book had just came out. And right around that same time is when the Discovery Channel had reached out, Robert Erickson from the Discovery Channel. And they had come across the article that I'd done on the entrance wound location for the first shot at the base of the neck. And they said, we've looked everywhere. This is the only thing that seems to have, tackled that subject. And so we're going to do a show on the magic bullet, and we would like to include that. And so they hired a film crew out of Omaha. Robert flew in. And then I had one of our clients at the office who was about the same size as Bill as Kennedy. We spent about 12 hours in the office one day. Anyway, he asked me, this is a long answer to a simple question. He asked me the same question, and I said, it's the single bullet fact. It's nothing else makes any sense. It's not, I don't know what else to call it.
Yeah, no, I agree. What other did you do any other ballistic tests? I mean, you have a Mantler Carcano rifle. Did you?
Yeah, so I did. The first thing on my list was, right, it was only one person in the history of the whole world has ever fired this thing 3 times in under 6 seconds, and he was some sort of, FBI super marksman, right? Is the narrative that's out there, and I thought, okay, well, let's start there. And I shot guns. I grew up, I hunted. I mostly shot guns and pheasant hunting and stuff. But so I bought one, took it out one day, and I put up a paper target on a box at 85 yards. Okay. And I didn't have a window or boxes to lean on to shoot through, so I just got down on one knee. So arguably a more unstable position. And I thought, well, I'm just going to try to shoot 3 times. Now, at this point in time, the gun, I had just had the gun for maybe a month or something, and I hadn't sighted in the scope on it. So I thought, well, I'll just use the iron sights. And so I put 3 shells in it, got down on a knee and fired 3 times. And if I remember right, I hit the target 3 times. And then I videotaped it, and it was like 5.8 seconds. And I'm like, well, this wasn't that difficult. I think it's merely for a lack of trying that it's so hard, So it kind of started there. And then, there's a lot of debate on what do the bullets do, right? What are they? Well, they're designed to hold together. So why did the one that hit Kennedy in the head break up into a million pieces, and the one that went through his neck, stayed intact? And so I think that was kind of the fog that I was trying to work through, if you will. And so I don't know, I'd get an idea, I'd go do it. I'd take my lunch break and go and fire some bullets.
Right.
There was something about the head wound that intrigued me, and I at this point I don't remember what, but I ordered some synthetic bone spheres, and these were like from Europe somewhere, like $100 a piece or something. And so I get these, and I had this big 5-gallon bucket of ballistic gelatin, and I had the FBI's recipe and all that stuff. And so I filled these things up with gelatin, and I went out and I put a cardboard box with a bunch of polyester stuffing in it, and stuck it behind it, and went and I shot and then videotaped it, and it didn't explode. And oh my goodness, I can't ever let that one go public, right? The reality is that the thickness of those spheres, it's like 7 millimeters or something, and where Kennedy got hit in the back of the head, it's thicker than that. It's probably more dense than that. It's a polyurethane stuff that I was shooting at. So I thought, okay, I'll try it again. I went to the hardware store somewhere, and I picked up some little square 1/4-inch tiles, and I duct taped one to the front of it, and then took a shot at it, and that thing absolutely exploded into a million pieces. And so then I took it and I X-rayed it, and so I could see the fragment pattern. If there was a pattern, there wasn't. It was kind of all over the place. And then I dissolved the gelatin and took out all the metal particles and dug through the box, and and I ordered them all biggest to smallest on an X-ray plate and X-rayed it. And some of these things I think became images on my website or something. But the nerdy professor kind of guy coming up with ideas and testing them. But I learned an awful lot about that gun and about the bullets and what they do and what they don't do, and it helped improve my working thesis on what I thought happened, I guess. And yeah, there was a lot of bullets spent doing a lot of things.
So can a fully jacketed round of ammunition produce fragments when hitting a skull?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, some people say it's impossible.
Yeah, it's not. Most of the time when I get challenged on that, I invite the person up here and tell them that I'll just place it on the side here. You'll be fine. But if you want to be the target and back it up, we can do that, or the guns, I think it's probably a half dozen times I've done something like that where I've invited somebody had a claim about the gun, right? And I'll say, I've got one, I've got ammunition, you get that plane ticket, you can stay at my house and we'll go and test your ideas. Nobody's ever took me up on it.
No, unfortunately not. That's too bad. Okay, so look, is there anything else I didn't cover on the autopsy materials that you want to bring up?
There might be some people out there that talk about it's about a centimeter below the cowlick entrance where there's a fracture there, and they talk about there being like a bullet fragment right there. Okay, and it's not bullet. It wasn't metal. It was actually a little piece of bone that had broke off when the skull fractured. And I was looking at this earlier today, that what was really strange about that is that the same pathologists were looking at those in the 1970s and didn't know what it was. which goes back to my whole point is I just don't think the education was the same back then. Now we could talk is there still inklings going on about the orientation of that F8 photograph?
Well, I'm sure that I never understood that, to be honest. It's beyond my understanding as a mere mortal. But yes, I'm sure that they're still going on about it, how it proves, I mean, front.
When we finally got to that photograph and we were at the big question, right? It was, am I going to win my own mental jackpot here and have, figured this out by looking at this black and white or not? And so anyway, we got to that photograph and we looked at it and there was probably a 5-second pause. And I looked at Larry and I'm like, holy crap. And he's like, what? I said, there's his cheek. And he goes, what? And I said, right there, that's his cheek. Okay. And so when you're looking at that photograph the correct way, President Kennedy's cheek is here and he has that kind of nice orangish little tan, and you could see it right there and you could see fuzz from the sideburn and some of the ear. And then you could see his upper trap muscle right here. And then in one frame, the camera had kind of moved like this and you had an expanded view of this area and you could actually see adipose tissue from when they had likely done the dissection through his neck, trying to find where the bullet went, and I thought, oh my goodness, the thought you mentioned about, why don't they release these things? And, certain things like that would finally go away if they would release one of the color images of it. It was clearly a picture taken from the front. I came back from there and I was so upset by it because it was so obvious. And so later in life, I worked for a company that was a franchise, and they would have their annual conventions every year in Dallas. And one time I went down there, I would take small groups down there and give them a little tour or whatever. And anyway, I was down there one day, and Robert Groden was down there on a Saturday selling his wares, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to confront him on that I regret it because I left there and I said, next year when I go down to this, I'm going to do it this time.
Right.
I ended up leaving the company and they moved the annual event anyway to Memphis or somewhere or Nashville, and I never got it done. But there's no way anybody can look at the color version of that photograph and come away with the belief that it's of the back of the head. Not one way.
Is there just one photograph, or is there more than one?
No, there's more than I don't know. There were maybe three of them or four of them. I can't remember. There were two at least. I know that for sure.
Right.
Because they were numbers 44 and 45, I think. But my challenge has been for years that if you've seen that photograph and you're convinced that it's of the back of the head, I will meet you at the archives with the camera crew. Okay, we'll go into this thing together and discuss, because I cannot understand how anybody who's seen the color version of that believes that that's on the back of the head without just pure deceit.
Right.
So,
okay, well that's.
I mean, if I can say it stronger, I would. I don't know how, but.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you can say it stronger.
So okay. I think covering that is good. So
yeah, and that's why I do wish this stuff would come out, because I think that it's deserving of some more expert analysis of people who really perhaps can't go to the archives or can't get there to actually look at them.
I think personally, the thing that used to drive me in that argument was that you had, depending on the polls, 60 to 80% of Americans believing that there was a conspiracy and that conspiracy somehow involved their own government, right? And so when you have such a impressionable group of people of such size, things that aren't true that lead to things like that can cause people to do awful things in name of government hatred, right? And releasing things out there to satisfy some of that, I think would eliminate some of that. But yeah, I remember that being the motivator for me. But I can understand where the Kennedy family comes from too. So,
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I mean, I think that people were pretty upset when RFK's autopsy photographs were released in that last round of documents from the Trump administration. And the Kennedy family, I mean, I think RFK Jr. said okay, but I think the other members of the family were appalled that came out.
you can understand. I mean, it's for me to sit here as somebody, I was minus 11 years old when Kennedy was killed, right? I wasn't even born yet. For me to sit and try to stomp my feet and justify something to be released speaks of a certain, personal arrogance that my need to know is greater than a family's need to remain private. Two sides of the coin,
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thank you very much for being on the Trail of Delusion. And when this posts, I'm sure this will get a lot of comments, and people will be probably quite upset, and I'll probably get some private emails from probably a few people you know.
Yeah, well, that's good.
But
the only way you get through the truth to anything is to actually discuss it with somebody. So hopefully there's fruitful discussions in there somewhere.
Yeah.